I'm joined today by Bill Winters from Standard Chartered Bank, and he's the CEO. Bill.
Nice to be here, Linda.
So I have a couple of questions for you, and let me start with the world faces an enormous infrastructure gap, and emerging markets especially are in need of sustainable infrastructure financing. You said before that the financial products need to be easily understandable and standardized to attract long-term investors in infrastructure financing. What do you mean by that? How can the World Bank Group help make it happen?
I think the World Bank is already doing quite a bit to help in this regard. And what I mean by that is that there's really a huge amount of money in the world that's trying to do the right thing. So it's ESG funds or banks that have made specific commitments. Like Standard Chartered, we've committed to raise $300 billion over the next 7 years for sustainable finance. And some of that will come from ourselves, our own balance sheet. Some of that will come from investors. And investors don't have the size of team that the World Bank has or that Standard Chartered has to assess every project by project, to understand all the ins and outs of each one of these things. What they do have, though, is an ability to say, okay, I understand the broad parameters, and I understand that somebody has said this complies with a certain level of standard that's been set out. And I think the World Bank, together with the private sector, in some cases perhaps together with governments or regulators, can define those standards. So we know what's a good project and what's a not so good project. And I think when we know what a good project is, then assuming that the risk-return profile is also set up properly, so is acceptable, investors will put their money in much bigger size than they're doing today.
Right.
But the concern today is that investors invest in a project that they think is good, and I don't mean that the return is good, I mean that it's a bona fide green project. And then somebody comes by afterwards and says, that wasn't a good project at all. That's greenwashing. You're giving yourselves credit for being green, but you're not. So having standards will give everybody the confidence to put the money in that's actually trying to get put to work but is having a hard time getting put to work.
And I think the key thing about standardization is really simplicity, right?
Yes.
So that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah.
You are deeply engaged in driving the global climate finance agenda, including a just transition to net zero emissions. In your opinion, how should the public sector, perhaps by working with MDBs, mobilize serious levels of private financing towards that goal? Any successful examples?
First of all, the whole idea of a just transition, it's surprisingly controversial. I mean, clearly there's a very vocal subset of the global population that is less concerned about just and more concerned about transition, and sooner rather than later. Given where Standard Chartered operates across Africa, Asia, Middle East, absolutely critical for us that we're affecting the transition to a zero carbon economy, but in a way that allows for underlying economic growth to continue. And I know that that's a core mission of the World Bank Group as well. So we share that together. But there's many ways that the public and private sector are working together to get some really impactful things done. Now, I'll take some of the projects that we've completed, whether they're very large renewable power projects in Africa or in India or in the Middle East, where we've brought together export credit agencies, so public sector at a government level, at a single country level, multilateral development banks, global capital markets, together with perhaps banks or other private sector lenders, into a financing package where the risk is apportioned to the person that's in the best position to actually manage that risk. Political risk may be best taken on by insurers or by the World Bank Group. Some of the construction risk may be best taken on by an export credit agency type lender. Some of the capital markets or foreign exchange risk might be best taken on by a private sector lender, et cetera. And so there's many examples of where that public-private partnership has worked. Prospectively, I'll look at some of the super high-impact programs like the JETPs, the Just Economic Transition Partnerships, that have been led by the UK, the EU, the US, in really important markets for us like Indonesia and Vietnam, where I think these are prototype projects that involve some really novel financing structures as well around the monetization of effectively carbon credits that come about as a result of terminating coal-fired power plants much earlier than their productive life. So maybe 15 or 20 years off the back end of the life of these projects. That's it's a critical component actually to decarbonizing the economy. But somehow we have to find the money to pay for that.
Exactly.
And these JETPs, where the private sector, organized largely through GFANZ, which is this financial services sector group, which has come together. I'm a principal in that group. The Net Zero Banking Alliance, which Standard Chartered chairs, where we are positioning private sector capital alongside prescribed public sector capital to deliver these really impactful climate reduction initiatives. So lots of good examples.
No, fantastic. I'm glad that you're in the throes of that and really helping to think through the problems. And speaking still on the same topic, building net zero cities requires investment spanning from power generation, like you mentioned earlier on, renewable energy, district cooling, to digitalization, of public services. To really make progress, governments need both access to new technologies and financial resources to deploy them.
Yeah.
How can financial institutions like yours help?
Yeah, we all know that it's much easier to build a new green city than it is to retrofit an existing city. And a new green city, in many cases, is economically viable in its own right, and doesn't need necessarily a huge amount of concessional capital or public money to catalyze that. Although in many cases that is happening in order to accelerate the development. But retrofitting a city or even a neighborhood is very expensive, and the returns in the short term are simply not there on a purely commercial basis. So having public sector capital come in, working together with private sector investors to understand the technology, understand what the returns are to society. In case if there's economic returns, super, but the societal returns, and then putting a public-private partnership together that addresses those critical funding gaps is really the only way to engage in retrofitting our existing infrastructure.
Thank you so much for giving us your
pleasure.
time. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.